When the world sleeps and silence covers the earth like a veil, some ancient questions awaken on their own, as if insisting on being answered. Questions that transcend religions, empires, and centuries, questions that many have tried to silence. Such as, why have so many narratives about Africa been erased? What lies behind the stories that shaped humanity? And who was, in fact, the man that tradition presented as Moses? In the deserts of Kemet, under the golden light that touched temples and crowns, there is a story that almost no one tells. A story that speaks of origin, of spiritual power, of African identity, and of a secret so profound that it has echoed through generations like an unfulfilled prophecy. There, between the Nile and the dunes, arose a young prince whose true roots were hidden, not by time, but by human hands that feared his greatness. And in this video, you will walk through the shadows of this mystery. You will discover how ancestral spirituality, African cosmology, and the secret rituals of Kemet shaped the destiny of one of the most powerful figures in history. You will see how his journey transforms not only the past, but also how we understand who we are today. So, before we cross this ancestral portal together, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening to this revelation from. May the ancestors accompany you on this journey. Darkness still lingered over the desert when an ancient question seemed to pierce the warm wind, as if from beyond time. They said certain secrets should never be disturbed, but there, among grains of sand that held memories of millennia, something whispered about a name known to all and understood by almost no one. The shadow of a forgotten prince seemed to want to awaken, as if demanding that his true story finally be heard. And in that ancestral murmur, what many feared to investigate began to be revealed. In the heart of Old Kemet, where the Nile flowed like a sacred vein, there were tales of a boy saved from the waters by royal hands. But what impressed the ancient storytellers was the deliberate silence surrounding this moment. As if the scene had been veiled for generations, hidden among faded symbols and incomplete accounts. Who was that child to cause such erasure? The answer began to stir like an echo, suggesting that the preserved version was neither the oldest nor the truest. Some elders said that, on that night, the waters carried not only a child, but a disturbing destiny. It was as if the gods had left an enigma floating, waiting for the right gaze to decipher it. The river's breath seemed to hold traces of something deeper, a lineage, perhaps, or a purpose that could not yet be pronounced. And while the Nile meandered silently, it also guarded the pact between birth and mystery. According to certain African oral traditions, the princess who found him would not only have taken in a baby, she would have recognized in him an unusual mark, a sign that only eyes trained in spirituality would perceive. Some believed that this small body carried an ancient energy, similar to stories of children destined to break down barriers between worlds. It was this energy that both frightened and fascinated, suggesting that its origin defied any simple explanation. And as its history began to emerge like fire from ashes, a new mystery crept in. Why were so many records about this moment altered, omitted, or softened over the centuries? The question did not seek an immediate answer. It merely paved the way for the next secret, like an ancient door that creaks slowly before revealing what lies beyond. The ancients said that Kemet breathed like a living being, with the Nile serving as its backbone and its banks pulsating in shades of ebony and gold. There, each dawn seemed to rise from within the earth, as if the sun itself had deep roots in that African soil. Cities rose imposingly, but true power lay in the eyes of the people, faces marked by the sun, skin as dark as sacred clay, and footsteps carrying stories that never made it into books. It was a world where spirituality and daily life walked side by side, without the division that later centuries would try to impose. Walking through Kemet was to feel the presence of ancestors in every carved stone, to hear the gentle sounds of priests reciting ancient formulas, and to realize that nothing there existed by chance. The temples pointed to the sky like spears of wisdom, aligned with stars that guided kings and peasants. Under the shadows of the columns, artisans drew symbols that told of more than victories and rituals. They told of an African worldview that should never have been forgotten. And it was in this setting that the figure we know as Moses breathed his first days in the palace. Storytellers describe the air of Kemet as laden with sweet fragrances, mixtures of resin, lotus, and myrrh that made any visitor feel as if they had crossed a portal. There, balance was governed by Maat, a principle that shaped justice, order, and harmony. The priests, dressed in feathers and light fabrics, walked with calculated steps, as if reproducing movements taught by the gods. No one dared to break that rhythm, for they believed that every gesture echoed in the cosmos. The streets teemed with life. Merchants traded under linen umbrellas, musicians played harps with sounds that seemed to float in the midday heat, and children ran among colossal statues with the naturalness of those who know that the sacred can also be everyday life. It was in this environment that kings and leaders were shaped, and perhaps that is why certain secrets were so closely guarded. In lands so rich in knowledge, any alteration in the collective memory could change the course of time. And as we observe this vibrant Kemet, we notice something curious. Many elements that define its grandeur have been softened or distorted over time. It's no coincidence that essential details about the origin and formation of important figures seem to have been removed from the dominant narrative. This sense of incompleteness pushes us forward, as if the land itself were inviting us to discover the next mystery hidden among its temples and dunes. The ancients said that Kemet breathed like a living being, with the Nile serving as its backbone and its banks pulsating in shades of ebony and gold. There, each dawn seemed to rise from within the earth, as if the sun itself had deep roots in that African soil. Cities rose imposingly, but true power lay in the eyes of the people. Faces marked by the sun, skin as dark as sacred clay, and footsteps carrying stories that never made it into books. It was a world where spirituality and daily life walked side by side, without the division that later centuries would try to impose. Walking through Kemet was to feel the presence of ancestors in every carved stone, to hear the gentle sounds of priests reciting ancient formulas, and to realize that nothing there existed by chance. The temples pointed to the sky like spears of wisdom, aligned with stars that guided kings and peasants. Under the shadows of the columns, artisans drew symbols that told of more than victories and rituals. They told of an African worldview that should never have been forgotten. And it was in this setting that the figure we know as Moses breathed his first days in the palace. Storytellers describe the air of Kemet as laden with sweet fragrances, mixtures of resin, lotus, and myrrh that made any visitor feel as if they had crossed a portal. There, balance was governed by Maat, a principle that shaped justice, order, and harmony. The priests, dressed in feathers and light fabrics, walked with calculated steps, as if reproducing movements taught by the gods. No one dared to break that rhythm, for they believed that every gesture echoed in the cosmos. The streets teemed with life. Merchants traded under linen umbrellas, musicians played harps with sounds that seemed to float in the midday heat, and children ran among colossal statues with the naturalness of those who know that the sacred can also be everyday life. It was in this environment that kings and leaders were shaped, and perhaps that is why certain secrets were so closely guarded. In lands so rich in knowledge, any alteration in the collective memory could change the course of time. And as we observe this vibrant Kemet, we notice something curious. Many elements that define its grandeur have been softened or distorted over time. It's no coincidence that essential details about the origin and formation of important figures seem to have been removed from the dominant narrative. This sense of incompleteness pushes us forward, as if the land itself were inviting us to discover the next mystery hidden among its temples and dunes. The elders recounted that, at that time, Kemet lived under a dark decree that hung like a heavy cloud over its people. A fearful pharaoh had ordered that all babies of a specific lineage be eliminated at birth, fearing a prophecy that foretold the arrival of someone destined to shake ancient structures. In the narrow alleys near the Nile, women walked with hurried steps, hiding children under linen cloaks while their hearts beat in a rhythm that defied the silence. It was as if each breath of wind carried the terror of losing what they loved most. In the midst of this silent chaos, an African mother realized that her newborn son carried something different. It was said that when she held him for the first time, she felt the air grow thicker, as if ancestors were drawing near to observe. Her eyes filled with tears, not just of fear, but of a sudden understanding that her little one did not belong to the common destiny. "This boy carries a calling greater than my own understanding," she is said to have whispered. And precisely for that reason, she knew she could not leave him there, exposed to the fury of a restless pharaoh. On a moonless night, enveloped by chance known only to the women of the village, she prepared a small basket. She chose strong fibers, blessed each strand with ancient words, and placed fragrant leaves at the bottom to soothe the baby's sleep. Then she approached the Nile, where the waters flowed slowly as if recognizing the weight of her gesture. When she set the basket on the surface, the river seemed to whisper something amidst foam and reflections, as if accepting the mission of protecting that life beyond human reach. The current carried the little one slowly, passing sacred stones, distant temples, and the shadows of trees that offered their leaves as a blessing. Some storytellers claimed that a faint glow accompanied the basket for a long stretch, like a flame that did not burn, but guided. The sound of the water mingled with the baby's soft cry, creating a melody that, according to ancient legends, awakened the guardian spirits of the river. And as the basket continued its course, the feeling was that all of Kemet was watching, even if in silence. Thus, guided by visible and invisible forces, the small vessel arrived at the shores of the royal palace, where powerful hands and eyes trained by the sacred would find the baby. And this encounter would change not only her life, but the course of entire civilizations. The next mystery was already beginning to take shape in the shadows of the palace, ready to reveal itself at the right moment. When the princess went for a walk along the banks of the Nile that morning, the air seemed heavy with a different kind of silence, almost as if the river were holding its breath. She usually sought moments of introspection there, away from the watchful eyes of the court, listening to the murmur of the waters that had always brought her peace. But that day, something called to her with unusual force, a soft sound, almost a lament, coming from among the reeds. Her steps slowed, and the wind seemed to swirl around her, pushing her toward a destiny that not even the oracles had foreseen. As she approached the small basket, the princess felt a shiver run down her arms, as if she were about to touch a story that didn't belong to her, but that had been waiting for her for a long time. When she lifted the lid, she saw the baby's face illuminated by a warm, vivid light, as if the sun itself had hidden itself within those features. Her eyes met the child's, and something broke within her, an immediate, ancestral, instinctive understanding. There was not just a survivor there. There was a promise, a mark, a mystery. She took him in her arms with a rare gentleness among royalty, and in that gesture, she felt filled with an energy that seemed too ancient to be explained. The baby, they say, stopped crying instantly, as if recognizing that touch. And it was then that the princess had the strange sensation of being watched not only by the guards, but by ancient spirits, entities that walked between the world of the living and the invisible. Her breathing deepened, and she knew she could not abandon him. As she brought him inside the palace, the princess faced perplexed stares, murmurs of disapproval, and even attempts to persuade her to get rid of the baby. But there was an unwavering strength within her, an almost sacred certainty. The priests approached to assess the newborn, murmuring words in languages few understood. One of them, the oldest, took a step back as he touched the child's forehead. "He carries a flame that cannot be extinguished," he is said to have declared. And his voice echoed through the corridors like a warning. Thus, against traditions, against unspoken orders, and against political logic, the princess decided to raise him as her own son. Within those walls of stone and gold, the boy would grow up surrounded by symbols, rituals, and secrets that would shape his worldview. And as his first days in royalty began, new questions arose in the air, questions that no one dared to formulate aloud, but that everyone felt vibrating like a distant drum, inviting the next mystery. Within the polished stone walls of the palace, the boy grew up surrounded by teachings that few in the world would have access to. The corridors echoed with the footsteps of masters, generals, and priests who came to instruct him in the most ancient arts of Kemet. From an early age, he demonstrated an unusual sensitivity when touching sacred objects, as if he recognized the symbols engraved on them even before learning to read them. The Guardian said that he absorbed knowledge like water in the dunes, silent, profound, and impossible to stop. And each day, his presence stirred more murmurs among the elders of the court. Training began at dawn, under the soft glow of the sun emerging from behind the colossal columns. There, the young prince learned to handle weapons, but also to master his own spirit. They said his movements had the precision of someone guided by invisible forces, as if the arts of war were merely a natural continuation of something that already pulsed within him. The masters observed him with wonder and respect, perceiving a rare balance between power and introspection, a combination that did not go unnoticed by the attentive eyes of the nobility. But it wasn't just his physical strength that made him stand out. In the halls dedicated to mysteries, he would sit before ancient papyri, decorated with symbols that spoke of creation, order, and destiny. When reciting passages about Ma'at, he seemed to understand more than the literal meaning, grasping nuances that escaped even the most experienced priests. Sometimes, during his readings, the flames of the lamps flickered as if reacting to his thoughts. And there were those who whispered that the boy carried an inner light that no training could teach. The temple rituals were moments of great anticipation. He walked among the columns in honor of the deities as if conversing silently with each one. The offerings he left always had a different touch, a gesture, a specific leaf, a detail that seemed guided by memories that were not his own. The older priests noticed this, but dared not intervene. After all, in places where the sacred and the human mingled, some things were simply not questioned, only observed with reverence. And so, as he grew up as an African prince shaped by the secrets of Kemet, his skills, his bearing, and his depth aroused both admiration and distrust. Something about him seemed to point to paths that no official map of the kingdom recorded. And this feeling, that his destiny transcended the limits of the walls that sheltered him, began to emerge like a persistent whisper, preparing the ground for the next mystery that approached on the horizon. In the profound silence of the subterranean chambers, where only the flickering light of torches dared to enter, began the most complex part of the young prince's training, his initiation into the mysteries of Kemet. There, far from ordinary eyes, priests dressed in white linen walked like living shadows, guiding those deemed worthy to cross symbolic portals. It was said that, inside, time did not flow as it did in the outside world. Each breath seemed to echo for centuries. And it was in this atmosphere charged with power that the prince took his first steps towards forbidden knowledge. During the rituals, he was led through narrow corridors that snaked like stone serpents. Each wall bore inscriptions that danced in the light, accounts of creation, of cosmic order, of the eternal struggle between chaos and harmony. The priests spoke softly, as if afraid to awaken sleeping entities. And as the young man touched the cold engravings, he felt a subtle energy course through his body, as if he recognized in the symbols something that had always been within him, just waiting to awaken. The air there seemed denser, almost liquid. The spiritual trials demanded more than physical strength. In circular rooms, he was placed before polished mirrors and pots containing essences that released intense aromas: lotus, myrrh, camphor. As he breathed in those fragrances, ancient images emerged like visions, rivers parting their course, pillars of fire, crowns raised to the sky. It was as if memories that were not his own intertwined with his own spirit. The priests observed in silence, trying to decipher what was manifesting within him, but not even they dared interfere with the flow of the invisible. At certain times, the prince was instructed to recite words of power, formulas belonging to the oldest language, the one the gods were said to have used to shape the world. Each syllable vibrated off the walls like a contained thunderclap, making the flames dance in response. It was said that only those with souls aligned with Mot could pronounce such words without losing their breath, and the young man did so with frightening ease. His mentors exchanged tense glances, realizing that something exceptional was unfolding before them. As he progressed through these initiations, something in his posture changed. His gaze deepened, his presence seemed to occupy spaces differently, and even his silences gained weight. It was as if each unveiled mystery opened even greater doors within him. But at the same time, a feeling arose that this path, so sacred and so dangerous, was leading him to a destiny that not even the priests dared to foresee. And this silent transformation left a premonition in the air that pushes us toward the next mystery already lurking. In the lands south of Kemet, where the Nile narrows and takes on deeper hues, there was a kingdom whose strength was as ancient as the mountains that surrounded it. Nubia, land of legendary archers, warrior queens, and temples carved from living rock, pulsed like a sister heart to Egypt. There, the heat seemed to carry stories that the wind dared not blow away, and each village held songs that spoke of forgotten alliances and lineages that stretched far beyond what the scribes recorded. It was in this territory, so close and yet so mysterious, that an ancestral bond began to form. The elders said that the blood of Kemet and Nubia had run together since times predating any known throne. The caravans that crossed the desert brought not only gold and incense, but stories of leaders who shared spiritual visions and common symbols. And as the young prince grew up amidst studies and initiations, rumors arose that his energy resembled that of those ancient Nubian rulers. It was as if something within him echoed traditions that even the Egyptian priests themselves could not fully trace. A whisper that blended past and future. On some early mornings, Nubian caravans would arrive at the palace bringing rare gifts, ceremonial obsidian masks, imposing hunting dogs, fabrics dyed with secret minerals. When the prince touched these objects, accounts said he would stand motionless for a moment, as if listening to something coming from afar. Some believed that these offerings awakened dormant memories in him, perhaps ancestral, perhaps spiritual. The priests observed cautiously, for they knew that ties between kingdoms could be both a blessing and an omen. Many storytellers claimed that, during some ceremonies at the temple, the young man recited chants that were not part of the official Kemet ritual. They were melodies with a different cadence, with deep, almost tribal notes, that made the flames of the lamps dance in an unusual way. Some priests recognized these sounds. They were chants from Kush, an ancient Nubian land. No one knew how the prince had learned them, and curiously, he didn't know either. He only said he felt the need to sing, as if a force were calling him from within the temple walls. These manifestations left a disturbing question hanging in the air. How far did the young prince's origins extend? His features, his intuitions, and his spontaneous connection with Nubian symbols led many to believe that his history crossed borders. And this mystery, this possibility that his identity was greater than any recorded genealogy, began to gain strength, preparing the ground for the next secret, which approached like a warm wind from the south. As the years passed, something began to stir within the prince, as if two distinct currents flowed through his spirit, vying for a space he couldn't name. On one side, there was the noble upbringing, the discipline of the temples, and the certainty of belonging to the heart of Kemet. On the other, strange premonitions arose, fragmented visions, and a restlessness that no priest could appease. They said that sometimes, while walking through the palace corridors, he would suddenly stop, as if hearing distant voices, voices that didn't speak the language of royalty, but echoed like memories he had never lived. During the official celebrations, while the people hailed him as the heir to a powerful lineage, his eyes would sometimes wander to the horizon. It was as if the gleam of gold and the weight of the crowns awakened in him a feeling of belonging and not belonging at the same time. Certain gestures, certain words, and even certain rituals touched him strangely, as if something within him were trying to remember another life, another home, another people. The elders perceived this silent conflict, but dared not question it. After all, the sacred also dwells in what is not understood. Gradually, this duality began to provoke intense dreams. The prince saw unknown deserts, simple tents, calloused hands manipulating tools, and chants that mixed pain and hope. On some nights, he would wake up sweating, with the feeling that these visions were more real than his own ornate room. There was a smell of clay, of campfire, of sun-baked skin. He tried to ignore it, but each dream seemed to pull him away from the palace, as if he were being called by roots that no one had ever told him about. The conflict intensified during the temple rituals. While receiving instructions about his royal lineage and his mission as Prince of Kemet, a part of his spirit seemed to recoil, as if listening to a narrative that didn't entirely belong to him. It was as if two stories tried to coexist within him, one written on the palace papyri, the other kept in the dunes and dark waters of the Nile. And the deeper he delved into the mysteries, the more he realized there was an absence, a page torn from his existence. This feeling of division, this silent call that insisted on repeating itself, made it clear that something was approaching. Like a distant drum beating before a great event, the prince's identity conflict was not merely internal, it was an omen, an announcement that hidden truths would finally begin to emerge. And it is precisely this growing tension that paves the way for the next mystery, which already moves like a shadow behind his steps. They say it was on a sweltering afternoon, when the sun seemed to boil the stones of the courtyard, that fate decided to reveal itself with brutality. The prince walked among the workers, observing the heavy rhythm of their daily tasks, when a cry cut through the air like a blade. Two men were arguing, an Egyptian guard, armed and arrogant, and a Hebrew worker, exhausted and weakened. The fight seemed ordinary to hurried eyes, but the prince felt something different, an ancient, deep pain, throbbing as if the blow to the man also struck him from within. The hot wind brought an eerie silence, announcing that something was about to break. The guard raised his arm again, ready to strike another blow, when the prince advanced without thinking. It was an instinctive movement, perhaps driven by the dreams that haunted him, perhaps by memories he didn't even know he carried. His fingers gripped the soldier's arm with surprising force, and in that instant, their eyes met, the guard's eyes filled with anger and wounded pride, the prince's eyes filled with fire and confusion. The tension was so thick it seemed capable of altering the air around them. The Hebrew, repentant and frightened, recoiled as if he had seen a spirit manifest itself. The ensuing clash lasted no more than a few seconds, but it would echo throughout the prince's life. A push, a loss of balance, a poorly calculated blow, and the guard fell with a dry sound, too heavy to ignore. Dust rose around the fallen body as if trying to hide it, but the damage was already done. The prince stood still, motionless, as if time had surrounded him. He didn't know if he had protected an innocent man or opened a door that would never be closed. In his ears, the world seemed distant, muffled as if underwater. Looking around, he noticed the expressions on the workers' faces: fear, surprise, reverence, and an indescribable sense of recognition. It was as if, in that impulsive act, something had been revealed, not just about him, but about what was to come. The young prince felt his heart race. For the first time, he wasn't just the nobleman educated in the palaces of Kemet. There was something in him that resonated with the suffering of the men around him, and that shook him more than the dead body at his feet. When the dust settled, the silence turned into a heavy warning. The prince understood that his life, until then shaped by rituals, masters, and veiled prophecies, had just changed course forever. The palace would never forgive such an act. The priests would try to understand the reason, and the generals would see a threat where there was none. It was the first step on a long road, and he knew he needed to leave before the next sign appeared. The horizon beckoned, and the next mystery began to throb like a distant heart. They say that night fell heavily that day, as if the entire sky wanted to conceal what was about to happen. The prince, overcome by a mixture of guilt, fear, and something he couldn't yet name, walked out of the palace walls as if bidding farewell without saying goodbye. The desert wind seemed to call him by name, dragging with it grains of sand that struck his skin like small reminders of the world to which he truly belonged. Each step was a silent rupture, with his real life, with his past, with everything he thought he was. But it was also a call to something greater, something the ancient deserts seemed to recognize. As he entered the dunes, the prince felt the world change. The air grew drier, the ground seemed to breathe beneath his feet, and the stars, once mere points in the sky, now shone with an almost spiritual intensity. He walked aimlessly, guided only by instinct and a constant feeling that someone, or something, was watching him from afar. It wasn't fear, but a presence that gave him the strange certainty that he wasn't alone. And the further he advanced, the more he felt he was leaving behind not only Kemet, but a part of himself forged by the palace. The nights in the desert were deep and full of sounds the city would never allow anyone to hear. There was the cracking of the dunes, the whisper of the wind among the stones, and sometimes, only sometimes, a distant song that seemed to spring from the very void. On some of those nights, he would light small fires to ward off the biting cold. And there, before the flames that danced like golden serpents, he felt his spirit empty. There were no titles, no crowns, no inheritances. It was just him, his breath, and a silence as ancient as the world itself. A silence that slowly began to teach him. During the day, the heat pressed down on him as if testing his strength. His lips were dry, his skin burning, hunger and thirst threatening to drive him off course. But even in his frailty, something within the prince remained firm. It was a feeling of being molded, purified, prepared. He remembered ancient teachings about leaders who needed to abandon comfort before they were able to lead a people. And the further he walked, the more he understood that his exile was not punishment, it was initiation. An initiation as ancient as the gods themselves. And then, as he walked among dunes that seemed identical and endless, the prince felt the air change. The wind stopped, the sand stood still, and the world seemed to hold its breath. There was a silent call, a distant glow that flickered like a live ember in the darkness. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he needed to follow it. Something profound, ancient, and inevitable awaited him ahead, and this encounter would mark the beginning of the next great mystery. The distant glow seemed to pulse like a heart within the night, guiding the prince's weary steps to a narrow valley. There, the silence took on an almost supernatural depth, as if every stone were watching. As he approached the light, he realized it came neither from the sky nor from human torches. It was a living flame sprouting from a dry bush, burning intensely but without consuming him. The air around him vibrated, and his hair stood on end as if something invisible had touched his skin. It was fire, but it was also presence. It was warmth, but it was also spirit. He approached cautiously, feeling the weight of something sacred fill the space. It was no ordinary desert site. There was order in that fire, there was intention. Each crackle seemed to pronounce syllables he didn't understand, yet recognized. His heart beat slowly, like that of someone before a truth they had waited a lifetime to find. The prince's eyes burned, not from the light, but from the feeling that what he saw was only the visible form of something much greater, ancient, and indescribable. It was as if he were standing before a portal. When he knelt, the air changed. The wind disappeared, the stars seemed to recede further, and a thick silence replaced all sounds. From that fire sprang a voice without origin, too deep to be human, too clear to be mere imagination. It wasn't a voice directed to the ear, it was directed to the spirit. The voice seemed to know every detail of his life, every doubt, every fear, every memory that had not yet emerged. And for the first time, the prince felt completely seen, unable to hide any part of himself. The presence revealed truths that echoed within him like thunder. It spoke of his people, not the people of royalty, but the people of tents, of journeys, and of silenced sorrows. It spoke of his origin, not the one written on papyrus, but the one engraved in flesh and deep memory. It spoke of a calling, not imposed, but inevitable, to liberate, to guide, to rebuild. And as he listened, the prince felt that all the loose pieces of his life were finally falling into place. The conflict that had accompanied him since youth was not weakness. It was a sign. It was preparation. As the flame began to diminish, the world breathed again. The wind began to blow once more, night returned to its form, and the prince rose changed, as if something burning had been placed within him. The bush remained ablaze, but now it seemed only a flame. The greater mystery had already been revealed. With his staff firmly in his hand and his spirit inflamed by what he had heard, he knew that his path was no longer one of exile. It was time to return. And this return, guided by the unquenchable fire, would lead to the next great mystery that awaited him in Kemet. The prince's return was not marked by trumpets or celebrations. It was silent, heavy as the air before a storm. When he crossed the borders of Kemet again, he seemed to carry not only a staff, but a presence that walked with him. The guardians watched him from afar, murmuring amongst themselves, unable to explain the change they perceived in his eyes. He was no longer the young man molded by the court, nor the frightened fugitive. There was a firmness in him that seemed to come from beyond the visible world, as if the desert had sculpted his spirit with the very hands of the invisible. Upon entering the cities, the prince saw what he had not perceived before. The people walked with their heads bowed, marked by long days of work and the constant shadow of authority. Women carried water jugs with slow steps, men moved stones under harsh orders, children observed everything with eyes that learned too early the weight of life. Each face seemed to tell a story of weariness, but also of silent resistance. And for the first time, he felt these pains as if they were his own, as if the voice of the burning bush had broadened his vision to see what had previously escaped him. When he entered the palace, the contrast was stark. Gold adorned the walls, perfumes filled the air, whispers of intrigue swirled among the imposing columns. But even there, his presence caused unease. Priests sized him up with cautious glances, realizing that this man no longer bowed to the old posture of obedience. Generals exchanged glances, wondering what this return meant. Even the pharaoh himself, upon seeing him, hesitated for a brief moment, as if recognizing that something greater than both of them was about to move through them. The silence between them was stronger than any argument. The prince announced his mission without raising his voice, but his words seemed to carry a hidden thunder. He spoke of liberation, of forgotten justice, of a people who had a right to their own existence. He spoke calmly, but each phrase fell to the ground like a sacred artifact, impossible to ignore. Some tried to laugh, others tried to reprimand him, but no one could deny that his presence altered the atmosphere. It was as if the fire of the burning bush still blazed in his eyes, as if his every gesture was being guided by something invisible that the others could not decipher. And so began a new battle, not between swords, but between profound truths. The prince's return awakened tensions that lay dormant beneath layers of silence and tradition. In the air, there was a feeling that ancient forces as old as Kemet were stirring once more. And as this spiritual confrontation began to emerge, a new mystery approached, poised to reveal the next chapter of this ancestral journey. In the days following his return, signs began to appear throughout the kingdom as if the very fabric of the world were unraveling. The first change came from the Nile, which dawned heavy, dense, and so dark it resembled old ink spilled on the earth. Fishermen retreated in fear, priests climbed onto platforms to observe the river with uneasy eyes, and rumors spread like wildfire among the houses. Something big was happening. It wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a symbolic gesture, a warning. Many said the gods were answering some profound calling, perhaps triggered by the prince who had returned. Soon after, an eerie silence fell over the fields. The frogs, always present on the riverbanks, disappeared for a moment, only to reappear in such great numbers that it seemed impossible.
They leaped through the courtyards, the markets, the temple corridors, as if they were disorderly messengers bringing messages from a larger world. People watched in astonishment, trying to understand if this was a sign of fury, change, or rebirth. And in each intrigued gaze, the question grew: who was driving these events? The priests gathered hastily, consulting ancient papyri, forgotten formulas, and incantations. Some found records that spoke of spiritual imbalances, others saw a connection to myths of rebirth and rupture. But regardless of the interpretation, there was something in common among them all: the perception that these events were not isolated. They were part of a cycle, a larger process that escaped human control. and in the palace corridors, it was whispered that the prince, the one who had disappeared into the desert and returned with his eyes burning on purpose, was connected to it all. Meanwhile, the prince walked through the cities, observing the changes with quiet firmness. He did not boast, he did not try to control anything, but he knew that each phenomenon had a profound spiritual purpose. A purpose that did not originate from him, but passed through him. Hearing the rumors, he perceived that some of the people felt hopeful, as if they saw in the events the possibility of a new beginning. Others, however, feared the reaction of the pharaoh and the religious elites, who would not tolerate signs that deviated from their official interpretations of the world. And as each new phenomenon unfolded, it became clearer that this was not a simple political or human conflict. It was a dispute of cosmologies, of principles, of sacred truths that had long been suppressed. The plagues, or signs, would continue to appear, each touching on deep layers of Kemet's spirituality. And this was only the beginning, because the next mystery approached like a silent storm on the horizon, poised to demand courage, faith, and even deeper revelations. The winds began to shift days before the event, as if the desert itself sensed that something grand was about to unfold before human eyes. When the prince led the people away from the stone cities, the air had a different smell, a mixture of sea air, ancient dust, and something else, something reminiscent of the breath of ancestors. Upon reaching the coast, the waves crashed with unusual force, like giant drums announcing a passage that did not exist. There, under the heavy sky, many felt fear, but also hope. It was like standing before a threshold between worlds. As the group gazed at the horizon, the prince walked to the water's edge and raised his staff as if awakening something asleep. The wind blew stronger, hair and cloaks swayed like living flags, and the sea began to move strangely, recede and advance, like deep breaths. Some storytellers said that, at that moment, there was such a profound silence that the sound of the waves disappeared completely. It was as if time itself were listening. The surface of the water shimmered in shades of silver and blue, revealing a path that was not yet a path, but already longed to be born. Then the impossible happened. The sea began to part, slowly, as if someone were lifting a heavy veil. The waters rose, forming liquid walls that shimmered under distant lightning, revealing a deep, damp corridor. The ground, once submerged, became firm as stone. The people watched, perplexed, feeling their hearts beat to the rhythm of that revelation. Children held the hands of their elders, warriors knelt without comprehending the grandeur of what they saw, and the prince remained at the front, guided not by pride, but by a calling that seemed to come from the very depths. The crossing began with hesitant steps. The sound of drops falling from the walls of water created a gentle, almost ritualistic rhythm, as if each person entering that path was being purified. Some claimed to feel presences beside them, luminous shadows, ancestral figures walking alongside, reinforcing the courage of those who feared. The air was cold, charged with energy, and the echo of footsteps seemed to tell ancient stories, stories of other peoples who had also crossed waters in search of rebirth. It was more than escape, it was a rite of passage. And when the last group reached the other side, the sea began to close again, erasing the corridor as one erases a secret written in the sand. The sound of the waters returning to their place was powerful, almost deafening, like a warning that this would not be easily repeated. The people fell to their knees, emotional and exhausted, while the prince gazed at the horizon with a grave expression. He knew that this crossing was not the end, but the beginning of a new stage, a stage that would bring other mysteries as profound as the waters that had just calmed. In the quiet of the first nights after the crossing, the people gathered around timid campfires, trying to understand what had happened. Many still trembled at the memory of the wall of water, others murmured prayers of gratitude, and some simply remained silent, looking at their own hands as if new life had sprung from them. It was in this atmosphere of rebirth that the prince began to climb the rocky slopes of an ancient mountain, guided by impulses that did not come from the body, but from the spirit. There, among stones shaped by the wind, something invisible called to him insistently. As he ascended, the air grew thinner, more sacred. Each step seemed to demand not only physical strength, but surrender. The prince felt his heart beat differently, as if he were entering a space where the visible and invisible worlds touched. The wind carried strange sounds, not human voices, but vibrations reminiscent of deep chants, echoing from before the memory of men. He moved forward, guided by this silent music, realizing that he was about to receive something that would alter not only his destiny, but the destiny of all who awaited him below. Upon reaching a plateau shrouded in golden mist, the prince saw an intense light erupting among the stones, not like ordinary fire, but like a pure, almost crystalline flame. He approached, feeling his body tremble as if the mountain were alive. The light pulsed, and at its center something solid began to emerge, smooth planks of unknown material, engraved with symbols that seemed to burn without being consumed. These symbols were not mere signs. They carried a profound force, as if they contained the very order of existence. The prince fell to his knees, overcome with reverence. As he contemplated those tablets, a truth imposed itself within him. This was not a human creation. It was too ancient, too wise, too profound. He recognized in the symbols traces reminiscent of Mot's teachings, balance, justice, truth, but elevated to a level that surpassed any mystery school. It was as if the universe had condensed its wisdom into lines of light. And, upon touching the gleaming surface, the prince felt a wave of energy course through his body, revealing connections between worlds, between times, between civilizations that had never conversed, but which shared the same divine principle. When he descended from the mountain, carrying the tablets enveloped in spiritual light, the people saw something different in his posture. He walked as one who carries not an object, but a pact. And each person who looked at those inscriptions felt something awaken within themselves, a glimmer of order, of awareness, of purpose. It was not merely a set of laws. It was a reminder that justice is not born of men, but of something much older. And this revelation illuminated the path to the next mystery, which still lay ahead, waiting to be unveiled. Over the generations, the figure of the Prince Prophet began to fragment like an ancient painting worn by time. The accounts that once circulated like wildfire among the people became whispers, then uncertain writings, and finally, polished versions that no longer carried the same force. In distant cities, scribes rewrote passages, softened details, adjusted descriptions. The protagonist's dark skin was lightened in many narratives, as if light had been forced to erase the original bronze. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible, but intentional erasure, as if someone wanted to break the link between him and the land that formed him. In the oldest mystery schools, some priests still preserved fragments that mentioned his education in Kemet, his connection to the Nile, his rituals and initiations. But these fragments began to be treated as distant legends, not as facts. Entire libraries were reorganized, papyri kept in locked chambers, and certain versions set aside. The world changed, empires fell, new peoples arose, and each of them shaped history in their own way. It was as if, over the centuries, invisible hands had erased piece by piece, leaving only a shadow of the true identity of that extraordinary man. Some storytellers, however, refused to let their stories be forgotten. In African villages, elders orally transmitted what the papyri had lost: tales of a fiery leader, born among Melanized peoples, shaped by Egyptian mysteries and guided by forces that defied understanding. These accounts spoke of alliances with neighboring kingdoms, of rituals that echoed Nubian chants, of symbols that revealed a deep African origin. But these versions never gained the reach of official histories, which had already been shaped by empires that preferred narratives more palatable to their own eyes. At certain times, scholars traveled to distant deserts in search of answers. They found worn reliefs, traces of figures that seemed to bear African features, incomplete records of princes educated in sacred temples, and oral traditions that coincided with ancient Hebrew legends. But in trying to piece things together, they realized that entire parts were missing: pages torn out, symbols scraped off, names replaced. The feeling was always the same. The true story was there, hidden just below the surface, but shrouded in veils that no one seemed willing to lift completely. And so, as time went on and versions multiplied, a persistent feeling arose. The intuition that there was more to the prince's story than the books showed. A profound truth, buried by interests and disputes. An echo that never fell silent. And it is precisely this echo, this silent call to recover what was lost, that paves the way for the next mystery, which awaits like a stubborn shadow beside the forgotten memory. The first signs emerged in isolated ruins, where the hot desert wind whispered through broken walls. Archaeologists walked among ancient stones, unaware that beneath layers of silence lay clues to the true origin of an entire people. In forgotten temples, they found reliefs depicting dark-skinned figures wearing robes similar to those described in ancestral accounts. Some symbols coincided with ancient Hebrew stories, others revealed spiritual practices common among African communities. It was as if two worlds, previously considered separate, secretly touched in that sacred space. Fragments of papyri also began to appear, often in fragile condition, bearing names and descriptions that did not match the most popular versions. Some mentioned leaders of African descent in distant caravans, others cited rituals that echoed Hebrew traditions, but were deeply rooted in Kemet cosmologies. These documents were carefully studied, but always carried an enigma. Why had so many references been erased or replaced? It was as if someone, centuries before, had tried to unify distinct stories, blending them in such a way that only attentive specialists would perceive the discrepancy. In caves near the Nile, excavations have revealed curious objects, Nubian arrowheads, amulets with archaic Hebrew inscriptions, and statuettes representing hybrid figures, blending African and Levantine cultural traits. Each find seemed to whisper about a people who moved between regions, carrying a multiple, complex, and still poorly understood identity. The scholars who analyzed these pieces had the constant feeling of reconstructing a mosaic whose original design had been deliberately blurred. With each piece found, a new question arose. In some villages, researchers recorded accounts passed down by griots and elders who spoke of an ancient migration involving two distinct peoples, united by suffering and spirituality. These accounts mentioned a dark-skinned leader, born near sacred waters, who guided groups through deserts and fertile lands. It was a narrative surprisingly similar to Hebrew stories, but preserved in African chants that had never been translated into foreign languages. Oral tradition, more resilient than many papyri, held fragments that connected Moses to African lineages that the academic world was still beginning to understand. Faced with so much scattered evidence, archaeologists and historians began to admit that there were far more questions than clear answers. The enigma grew ever deeper. Why so many cultural coincidences? Why so many similar symbols? Why so many gaps in official records? It was as if the deserts themselves hid more than they revealed, awaiting the moment when someone would finally courageously and respectfully put the pieces together. And so, this unfinished puzzle opens the way to the next mystery. A mystery that pulsates in the identity of entire peoples scattered across the world. In distant lands where the sun touches skin of many colors, the echo of the Prince Prophet's story found new ways to survive. In African villages, in communities scattered across the islands, in cities moved by drums and prayers, songs arose that spoke of a leader who liberated not only a people, but an ancient consciousness. These songs crossed centuries in the voices of griots, mothers, priests, and even children who repeated stories before bed. Each word carried the reminder that African spirituality was never silence. It was always root, always pulse, always living memory. Among those who lived far from Kemet, traditions arose that blended symbols from the sands of the Nile with resistance practices forged in foreign lands. There were groups that lit candles to remember their ancestors, others that played drums to summon protective forces, and still others that read ancient texts seeking traces of African presence in the scriptures. In each gesture, there was a profound intuition that something had been erased. And in trying to reconstruct what was missing, many rediscovered not only the prince's story, but their own history, the one that time had tried to bury, but which persisted in every heartbeat. In the African continent, peoples who for centuries faced invasions and diasporas began to look at ancient narratives with new eyes. The question, where did we come from? Rekindled profound searches, driven by archaeologists, historians, spiritualists, and curious young people. And the more they studied, the more they realized that there were connections between Kemet and cultures that flourished along the coasts, savannas, and forests of Africa. It was like rediscovering pieces of their own identity scattered along the way, each fragment shining like golden sand in the midday sun. In the diasporas, especially in the Americas, the echo of this history manifested itself even more intensely. Black communities, pressured by centuries of pain and struggle, found strength in traditions that united faith, ancestry, and resistance. For many, the figure of an African leader who confronted an empire and paved the way for an oppressed people became a powerful symbol of hope. His teachings were reinterpreted in chants, sermons, conversation circles, and spiritual healing rituals. It was as if, even without knowing it, they were repeating ancient steps engraved in the souls of their ancestors. And so, the memory of the prince was not lost. It merely changed form, like water taking the shape of the vessel that carries it. His legacy spread throughout the world, assuming different tones in each community, but always preserving the same pulse, the pulse of freedom, justice, and ancestral connection. And this pulse, which still vibrates today in the veins of millions, opens the doors to the next and final mystery of this journey, which awaits like a drum about to be played by the first hand. When the silence of night rested upon the desert, many said it was possible to hear the stories the sands still held, stories that belonged not to just one man, but to an entire people. In that silence, the prince prophet seemed to walk again, not in flesh, but in spirit, guiding those who wished to listen beyond the boundaries of time. There, where darkness meets the light of dawn, arose the reflection that the ancients carried, that no truth remains buried forever. The desert, patient, always returns what was hidden. Over the ages, scholars, spiritual seekers, and ordinary people began to realize that the story of Moses was not merely a religious narrative, it was a mirror reflecting the strength of African peoples, the resilience of diasporas, the courage to keep faith alive when the world tried to extinguish it. Each rite, each chant, each recovered symbol seemed to rekindle an inner light, reminding us that ancestral wisdom never ceases to pulsate. It simply awaits the right moment to resurface. And so arose the question that has always troubled later empires, temples, and traditions. What happens when a civilization rediscovers that its spirit shaped stories known throughout the world? In many places, this revelation provoked astonishment. In others, it provoked pride. But above all, it awakened a profound sense of belonging. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about recognizing that the sacred has roots that are older and broader than one imagines, and that these roots are as black as the fertile earth on the banks of the Nile. In the faces of modern people, the presence of this past begins to be reborn in small seeds. Young people researching ancestry, communities reclaiming languages, spiritual leaders reconnecting ancient practices with current challenges. It was as if a gentle breeze touched each one, reminding them that identity is not a recent invention, but a river that has flowed since time immemorial. And by following this river, many realized that the prince's journey continued, not in the footprints left in the desert, but in the steps taken by each person who seeks truth and liberation. And when we look at this legacy that spans millennia, we realize it doesn't end here. There are mysteries that still sleep beneath layers of sand and silence, awaiting those who dare to listen. The story of the Prince Prophet is just one of the doors, and by crossing it, we find others waiting to be opened. Tomorrow holds new revelations, new symbols, new encounters with the past. And each one calls us to continue walking towards the next mystery. When the last flame of history seems to go out, something within us continues to burn, as if we had walked side by side with an ancient spirit all along. The journey of the Prince Prophet does not end in the desert, nor on the tablets of light, nor in the narratives shaped by centuries. It continues now, in the hearts of those who listened. Because Africa holds not only facts, it holds spiritual memory. And each time we revisit these roots, a piece of the world awakens. The sands of Kemet still murmur forgotten names. The rivers still carry symbols that defy logic. The stories still shine in the voices of ancestors who refuse silence. And in touching this legacy, we feel that African greatness never disappeared, it merely waited patiently for our return. It's as if each mystery revealed opens space for 100 others, all vibrating beneath the surface of time. The past calls us not to nostalgia, but to recognition. To remember that African spirituality is foundational, not an appendix. That its influence shaped entire cultures, beliefs, and identities, even when the world tried to hide this in the subtext of history. And in recognizing this truth, something within us aligns, as if we were rediscovering the thread that connects body, earth, and spirit. Therefore, in closing this chapter, we are not ending a story. We are honoring a lineage. And we feel that there is still much to be awakened. In the ruins, in the symbols, in the dreams, in the songs, in the books, and above all, within each of us. Because the legacy of Africa does not live only in monuments. It lives in those who choose to listen. If this revelation touched you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue walking with me. There are other mysteries waiting to be told. And each one of them is waiting for you in the next revelation.